Hello and welcome to the NTI PodTalk. My name is Dianne Kaler and I'm Director of Nutrition Therapy Institute. Join me as I talk to interesting people in the field of health and wellness, food and farming, and anywhere else we find conversations that matter to our community. By listening, you'll learn a little about NTI and a lot about the things and people around you that make a difference for your wellness. Welcome and let's get started. Hello there, welcome. Thank you so much for being here this is another edition of the NTI PodTalk. My name is Dianne Kaler and I'm Director of NTI, and I'm here with a special guest that I'm very happy to be talking to, Lily Nichols, who is a registered dietitian, and she specializes in prenatal nutrition. And I think this is such an important topic because many of our students here and many of our grads are interested in this field. And so I'm really excited to have Lily. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for the invite.
Yeah. So I want to talk first about your work in this prenatal nutrition field that shows up in the form of the books that you've written. So I have on my list here, Real Food for Gestational Diabetes, Real Food for Pregnancy, and Real Food for Fertility. And I think the fertility book is the most recent book. And there is a common theme to all of these books that is represented in the title, which is real food. And what I think is so interesting about this, and this is what I'd like you to talk about, is why do you have to make the distinction that you are sharing a message about real food? What's the real food difference between what you talk about and maybe what shows up in other places and other voices?
So, I mean, the choice of that title is partially because of my background as a dietitian. I find myself often straddling a couple different worlds, right? Like,
Right.
I'm a bit more holistically minded and always have been, and was introduced to ancestral nutrition before I even went through any of my formal training as a dietitian. So the choice of including real food originally for the gestational diabetes book, which was the first one, was because I was writing about a different approach to managing that condition than is conventionally used. So if you go by, the conventional guidelines, half your grains are whole, and artificial sweeteners are encouraged in place of natural sweeteners, and you need to take the fat out of everything and discard the egg yolk, and you're not like encouraging nose to tail eating because some of those items are high fat and high in saturated fat and cholesterol and the horror, right?
Oh, yes, right.
Yeah. So
don't want to do that.
yeah. So I chose the term real food to represent that I was taking a more, whole food approach to these conditions, and to identify that it wasn't a conventional dietetics approach. I could have chosen the title for, instead of real food for gestational diabetes, I could have chosen low carb for gestational diabetes, because my recommendations are lower in carbohydrates than conventional. But that doesn't even fully represent it, because it's not just about cutting carbs, it's about what you're eating in their place. And also, not all clients have to necessarily cut carbs. Like, so much of it is individualized, right? I felt that real food just better encompassed how I was going about things, which is less processed foods, more unprocessed foods, and a little bit more of an ancestral approach to nutrition as a whole, rather than relying on fortified foods for folic acid or fortified foods for iron. Like, I'm really encouraging whole food sources of folate, whole food sources of iron. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and that is what draws me so much to your work, is because you do have that emphasis on nutrient dense real foods, whole foods. You incorporate egg yolks, and you incorporate organ meats in your recommendations, and bone broths, and that's certainly what we teach here, because those are the places where you find such concentrated high levels of nutrients. And, um, you know, this kind of habit that we've gotten into in our standard American diet, where we've gotten away from eating egg yolks, and, you know, the organ meats kind of left a long time ago, but certainly in the last 40 years, people have been, you know, um, egg white omelets, like that is considered a health food. And, you know, skinless chicken breast, that's considered a health food.
Right.
Whereas you're missing out on a lot of nutrients when you remove those things. And that's essentially a form of processing, right? When you remove something, or refinement, I guess, you're refining it, you're taking something out. And when you do that, you're removing a whole class of nutrients. And my son is 26 years old, and I wish I would have known more about this when I was going through my, pre-pregnancy and pregnancy educational experience, because I didn't really know anything about nutrition back then. But I certainly didn't know that you should be eating egg yolks and organ meats. So
Yeah.
yeah, so I so much appreciate that you incorporate that kind of information. And you say your approach is different than a standard or conventional dietetics approach. So this might be a loaded question, but why do you think that a standard dietetics approach doesn't include more of these nutrient dense, more ancestral type food items in their recommendations?
I think ultimately it comes down to our guidelines being based on incorrect or incomplete information. So if you really like, I've tried to look at like where a lot of my questions revolve around like, where did these guidelines even come from? I
Right.
mean, I knew they were flawed because, like I said, even when I went into school, I was already eating like full fat everything, and like I had overcome vegetarianism and all that stuff.
Yes.
Um, but it was like I didn't realize just how lacking the evidence is that they're based on. So, we had our first dietary guidelines come out in the early 1980s. They were really heavily influenced by Ansel Keys' flawed work, the 7 countries study, and the diet heart hypothesis. So they center around reducing our intake of saturated fat and cholesterol and salt. Saturated fat,
Right.
cholesterol, and salt.
Right.
So if you are taking away fat and trying to minimize your intake of saturated fat and cholesterol, you are then taking the fat out of all of the animal foods as much as you can, which is why we have the low fat, non-fat dairy product recommendation and the lean meats and boneless, skinless chicken breast. Of course, the organs are highly concentrated in cholesterol. Not all of them, like heart is pretty lean. It does have a fat layer. It depends on the health of the cow, of course.
Right.
But,
Right.
liver is very high in cholesterol.
Right.
The egg yolks are very high in cholesterol. So these recommendations, I think, ultimately are an offshoot of that. And if you are restricting dietary fat, you have to be eating calories from other places, namely protein and carbs. You can only eat so much protein. I mean, even though our RDA for protein is set way too low, there's a separate recommendation called the AMDR, the Acceptable Macronutrient Distribution Range, which gives a percent of calories. And they say you can eat up to 35% of your calories from protein. So even in the guidelines, they give you a huge range, 10 to 35% from
Right.
protein.
Right.
It's really hard to even eat 30 or 35% of protein. So that means that the remainder of your diet, when you've restricted the fat, is coming from carbs. So I think the carb recommendations are simply a consequence of the restricted fat intake, that are a consequence of shoddy, incorrect, biased research from essentially the 1950s when Keyes did much of his research. So I think that's how we got to where we are. The prenatal guidelines are simply an offshoot of the population-wide dietary guidelines for America. And having worked at a very small level at the public policy level with the state of California's diabetes and pregnancy program, where we were trying to, like, at the time, they had just shifted from the food pyramid to the plate. And
Mhm.
so we were working on making like updated graphics that would represent like a gestational diabetes plate. And it's also dumb when you when you talk about this, but nonetheless, that was
Right.
one of the topics that all the state level dietitians in this organization were working on. And we were coming up to all sorts of problems with the sister organizations because the plate that we wanted to come up with didn't match the general maternal health plate, which
Uh,
matched the My Plate, the USDA My Plate.
mhm.
Um, because we were trying to represent that like you needed to restrict the carbohydrates a little more. You couldn't just have like fruit and dairy and grains all at the same meal. That'd be too many carbs for somebody with gestational diabetes. And
Right.
this is even the opinion of very conventionally minded dietitians who did not agree with much carbohydrate restriction. And that was enough to like cause problems, right? So I use that as a small example of it's all an offshoot of the general public dietary guidelines. I think that's how we've gotten into the sticky situation that we're in now. And when you start to like unravel more of the key nutrients for a healthy pregnancy, you run into all sorts of issues because you get into nutrients like choline, which is like the most recent nutrient to be added to our list of essential nutrients. It was determined to be so-called essential in 1998. So again, that's like almost 20 years or so after the original dietary guidelines came out. And all of a sudden now it's like, oh, our body cannot endogenously make enough choline. We have to get it from the diet. Well, what are your most choline-rich foods?
Yep. Egg
Cholesterol
yolks and
containing
liver.
foods.
Right?
Exactly. And you'll
Yeah.
get teeny amounts in beans and cruciferous vegetables and nuts and shiitake mushrooms, but the most concentrated sources by far, egg yolks and liver. I mean, you look at a typical American's diet, over half of their choline intake is coming from egg yolks. But we were all told for 2 decades to minimize it, right?
Mhm,
So
mhm,
you can find multiple examples of this where they just don't actually like keep up with nutrition research. Like now we've learned a lot more about our body's needs for all these different so-called non-essential amino acids, which probably are actually essential, but
Yep.
our guidelines aren't based on that. The RDA for protein was, they didn't create a separate one for vegetarians at the time because it was assumed that vegetarians were eating half of their protein from animal sources, namely dairy and eggs. Well, that may
Mm,
have been true in the 80s and 90s, but
mhm,
nowadays, your typical plant-based or vegetarian eater is not eating barely any eggs or dairy.
mhm,
So now we actually probably should be setting a separate protein recommendation for them, right? But a lot of these things are like built on assumptions, and then we learn more, and we probably need to go back and revise them. We're just
mhm.
not necessarily seeing that happening very quickly.
Yeah, and it seems like it's such a huge, behemoth bureaucracy to get anything changed now because there are so many um, opinions that have to do with one's like personal principles and dogmatic philosophical beliefs, as well as all of the industry influences. And now it just feels like it's so challenging to get these changes made because, you've experienced it years ago trying to get something different for one niche area of practice, which is gestational diabetes. And I mean, I follow a lot, Nina Teicholz, the Nutrition Coalition, and, she's constantly talking about, um, having these conversations with these agencies and representatives who work in these agencies. And it's so challenging to get them to even recognize that, number one, changes need to be made. And if they do need to be made, all the different voices that influence that. And then they just end up not doing anything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we could I think the one like low-hanging fruit thing that should absolutely be reformed is to at least raise the RDA for protein.
Yeah.
And then that will have carryover effects for the other things, but that would go a long way.
Mhm.
But yeah, Nina's work is fantastic. I support their work, the Nutrition Coalition.
Mhm.
I had to make a choice early on. It's like, do I keep trying to come up against the bureaucracy and like push the needle a little bit more this way, or do you just put the good information out into the world in the form of books and cite it like crazy so that people don't think I'm just a complete nutso, but like,
Right.
what here, it's not just my opinion, here's the
Right.
study, right? And
Right.
here's the hundreds of studies, and put that information into the hands of women and families and clinicians, and let there be kind of like a public pressure, like a grassroots level of change. Because some OBs, they don't think that a gestational diabetes pregnancy could end in anything other than absolute catastrophe for the mom and the infant, all these other complications. The baby's going to be born macrosomic, and they're going to go hypoglycemic, and they're going to have breathing issues. All these things are going to go horribly wrong. And they don't know that things can actually go right when we just fix the nutrition until they see it firsthand. And then they're like,
Yeah.
whoa,
Oh.
I've never seen a healthy, infant of a diabetic mother, until
Wow.
they see it with their own eyes. And then they start to be more like, okay, well, maybe nutrition does have a bigger
Mhm.
role here. And what did you do? Oh, you were reading this gestational diabetes book. Oh, you didn't
Mhm.
listen to our in-house dietitian or the hospital dietitian.
Right.
Let me take a look at that. Um, and that's how I've kind of like decided to go about eliciting change, because I think I'd lose my mind trying to butt up against the bureaucracy. There's only so much that one
Mhm.
person can do.
Mhm. Yeah, that's awesome. And I say this all the time. I think that the interest is growing and people are looking for other pieces of information, other ways to learn rather than relying on one single source, whether it be, in their doctor's office or the hospital dietitian or whatever. And I think it's growing even more now, that people are really interested in getting that knowledge so that they can be empowered to make decisions for themselves, because this is what I think so many people are challenged by. They go to their doctor, and whatever the health condition is, they say, well, what should I eat, or what should I not eat, or what should I do about my dietary choices to, help with this situation? And so many times they hear, oh, what you eat doesn't matter. It has nothing to do with it. And it just is so baffling and maddening that they are instilling this belief in the population who's looking to them to be a trustworthy expert, and the trustworthy expert says what you eat doesn't matter. So I think people are, starting to realize that that's not so much the case, and there is a place for nutrition, and certainly an important place, because everything that happens in the body happens because of the presence or the absence of, um, you know, certainly single nutrients as well as collections of nutrients. And so this drive for people to want to learn more, I think, is growing. And I'm so happy to see that. And I'm so happy to see that you are out there with this particular message for prenatal health, because it's so critically important. I mean, it's cliche to say that our children are our future, but they are.
Yeah, totally.
And it starts even before pregnancy to make sure that those children are healthy in fetal development and then once they're born. So,
Couldn't agree more.
yeah, yeah. All right. So, as I mentioned, so many of our students here at NTI come to us because they have an interest themselves, because of personal experience or something that they've seen in their um, friends, relatives, whatever, where they didn't get the prenatal nutrition education that they, now realize that they should have gotten or would have wanted to have gotten, and they see that there is so much benefit to providing that. And so that is a very common theme that our students come in saying, once I graduate, I want to work in this field of prenatal nutrition. And that brings us to the next topic that I want to talk to you about, which is your Institute for Prenatal Nutrition, because this is a advanced educational program that you have for professionals, health professionals. And I think our graduates would be interested in participating in your Institute for Prenatal Nutrition. So I'd like to spend some time talking about what is it, why did you start the program, and kind of talk about, what people take away from that, and then how that expands on their knowledge and what they can do in this field.
Yeah, sure. So the Institute for Prenatal Nutrition, or I call it IPN for short because it's kind of a mouthful of words, is, many years in the making. It is a formal mentorship program for professionals so that they are well-versed in really any issue that's going to come up with a client during pregnancy, and also postpartum. We cover postpartum and breastfeeding in it as well. It's sort of just like again, like kind of a natural progression, I think, of my career, in that with the way that I write, which is very detailed and cited with research, a lot of professionals really like my books. And then they kept coming to me asking for more education. So a colleague of mine and myself, we founded the Women's Health Nutrition Academy, and we just put out like individual webinars, and we've done that since 2018. And that's all great. That's like one way to help get information out to professionals. But what I found was that people really needed a container for mentorship, not just like an informational webinar in 5 minutes to maybe be able to get a question answered, but they need a little more hand-holding. And so that's why I thought that building out IPN would be helpful. Everybody kept asking me, where can I get trained in prenatal nutrition? And there's really not a program out there. And, there was even like a 2024 survey of OBGYN residents. So these are, doctors training to be MD, well, they're MDs, and they're training to specialize in obstetrics. And they asked about what amount of education they had in pregnancy-related nutrition. And nearly half of the doctors reported 0 hours of dedicated nutrition-related education. Another 49% reported 1 to 2 hours, and the remaining 3% reported greater than 2 hours. Okay.
Wow.
And then I started thinking, okay, well, this is why they refer out to nutrition professionals. And then I was like, but wait, I really didn't get that much education in prenatal nutrition in my undergrad. So like we had a single course on life cycle nutrition, which went from, babies through infancy, toddlerhood, all the growth phases, and included pregnancy and lactation, and then, nutrition for the elderly and all that. But it was like, I'm pretty sure I had like 1 lecture on this. So I'm like, well, let me poll my social media following. I have a lot of dietitians. I was like, how much training did you have in prenatal? 74% said 1 to 2 lectures. 18% said none. And then 8% had a semester-long course. So it does seem like some programs, 8% of my following, they had a course. This, for most, said that this was an elective course. But then when I've talked to them, it was all just the standard guidelines. So nothing beyond, you need X number of calories more, and don't eat liver because vitamin A toxicity. And it was just like very standard run-of-the-mill type stuff. So in other words, there's a huge gap here in that, okay, we know like doctors aren't trained in nutrition very well. Dietitians aren't trained in prenatal nutrition very well. Like, where do you go? There's no there's no like source that I can refer people to. So I'm like, well, I'll build it myself.
Create it. Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's what we do. It's a pretty detailed program. I mean, each week there's a new 2 hour long lecture, and then we have a 90-minute Q&A every single week. We build in a lot of case studies. We meet virtually, of course, and so we have, Zoom breakout rooms for various like client situations to work out in smaller groups. We have assignments that are specific to things that'll actually be clinically useful to you. I'm really kind of anti-busy work. So
Yeah.
it's really assignments that focus on applying the information. I just really want to see how people think. I also feel like a pretty big responsibility because we have a graduate directory and we refer people there for help individually, and I don't want to graduate anybody who I don't feel has a good handle on the material. So part of doing the assignments is that so we can grade them and give feedback and actually like support and mentor the individuals. So you don't just have a program where people sign up, don't do any work, and they're a graduate. We're kind of on people's case about doing it.
Yeah.
So we keep our group size relatively small. I only run the program once a year because it's a lot of work for myself and our team. So, but it's been really, really wonderful to see what people are able to accomplish after the fact. We have some individuals who specialized already in prenatal nutrition, but they felt a little bit like they were flying blind. So they have a lot more clinical confidence. You have peer support in our private membership community as well for getting like clinical feedback on how to handle different cases. And then we have some people who maybe are nutrition professionals, midwives, OBGYNs, acupuncturists. Like we have a whole range of health professionals who maybe didn't specialize in this area or didn't have a specific skill set in prenatal nutrition yet. And now they can build that into their services. So yeah, it's been really fun, and we're looking forward to the next cohort in 2026.
Nice. Yeah, I love it. How long did you say it is? How long of a program?
It's 18 weeks.
18 weeks. Okay. All right. Yeah, that's awesome. And I like the holding people accountable aspect of it. We're very big on that here too. We have assignments and exams and all that kind of stuff, and it's so important that people can actually show that they understand the material and can exhibit that depth of knowledge before, like you say, when they go out and graduate, I have the responsibility of making sure that they actually know what they're talking about when they leave here. And, same with you with your program. So I'm very much on board with having assessments and assignments that you're reviewing and providing grades. We provide grades and feedback. So that's awesome.
Yeah,
all right. Well,
nutrition is complicated, right? It's like you can change the wording on something just ever so slightly, and then what you're saying is incorrect.
Right.
It's
Yes.
like it's a really tricky field of study, and it's a really tricky one from
Yes.
a health communication standpoint too.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And you have to know the background science. You have to know obviously the anatomy and the physiology and the biochemistry, but you have to understand the biochemical pathways of how nutrients actually work, because if you can't explain that, then when you're making a recommendation, well, eat kale or whatever it is, if you don't understand why you're making that recommendation, it's kind of an empty recommendation. There's not much knowledge or power behind it. And the clients that you're working with need to know that you do have that knowledge, and that's what builds confidence from their perspective in your work as a nutrition professional and a reliable guide. So yeah, absolutely. It is very important to have that assessment of what people know and what they're saying. So yeah. All right. Well, this has been a really fun conversation. I also wanted to mention just a personal thing. I have been aware of so many people that I see you interacting with. And I just noticed recently that Aviva Ram wrote the foreword on one of your books, and I'm forgetting which one it was. It might have been the fertility
Real
book
Food
or
for Fertility. Yeah.
Fertility. Yeah. I met Aviva Ram, and I have known her for many, many years when she was really, before she was a doctor, when she was
Yeah.
really big in the herbal community. And she, was in executive positions at the American Herbalist Guild, and I would go to their conferences every year. My first introduction into education in sort of this holistic world was I went to herb school and became a certified herbalist. So I used to interact with Aviva Ram just a long time ago and have always looked up to her. And so when I saw that she wrote the foreword, I was like, oh, another connection. And I met Diana Rogers so many years ago, and then I know that you were a regular contributor when she was doing her podcast, The Sustainable Dish, talking about prenatal and
Yeah,
infant
Dianne is
health.
great too.
Yeah,
Aviva's wonderful. We were very humbled that she volunteered to write the foreword for Real Food for Fertility. We're like,
that's
really?
awesome.
Really?
Yeah,
We found out we were writing a book. Lisa and I were writing a book together and reached out, and we were very flattered. She's a lovely human. She joined me in the IPN group. We have an alumni group that continues to meet monthly, and Aviva came and presented on herbs and pregnancy and
nice.
postpartum, which is so helpful. She's such a trusted resource, particularly on that angle of herbs. So
Yeah,
yeah, it's a fun line of work to be in, to have so many cool different humans specializing in different areas. To
yeah.
Nina Teicholz too. I always don't know how to say her name. I think you said it
I,
differently than me, but
yeah, and I don't know how she says it, but I've heard people say Thai Colts, so,
okay, well,
but
one
I
of
don't
them is
know.
correct. But
Yes,
Nina of Nutrition Coalition,
yes,
she's also a wonderful human. I mean, there's really great people that are all, pulling in their individual ways. Diana's work around sustainability and
yep.
nutrition provided by animal source foods is so important. And I very much appreciate her voice in this dietetic
Hmm.
space as well.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I had Lisa Hendrickson-Jack on the podcast probably about a month ago. So
Oh,
yeah,
great.
yeah.
Yeah. Obviously, she's a wonderful human, because I wouldn't
Yes.
have co-authored a book unless I thought very highly of her and her work.
Right. Right. Awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, so tell our viewers and listeners where they can find information about you, both you as your work as a registered dietitian and then the Institute for Prenatal Nutrition.
Yeah, so you can find pretty much everything is linked out from my main website, lilynicholsrdn.com. There you'll find my blog. There's no paywall on my site, so there's hundreds of articles for free. There's freebies. My books are there. Under the services tab, IPN is listed. It also
Okay.
has its own website, instituteforprenatalnutrition.com. It's kind of long. So if you want to just go to my main site and click through from the services tab, that's perfectly fine. That's where you can learn more. We open enrollment once a year, usually in the fall, and our cohort runs from the beginning of year to about May. We'll see. We're finishing up this year's cohort. We'll see next year what schedule we settle on. Some of it is determined by the number of students we accept, because sometimes we have to add a few extra weeks to make up for case study presentations to accommodate everybody. But generally, I'm trying to finish by end of May, so that people have their summers to themselves and aren't
Right.
bothered with busy work. So we pack a lot in a short period of time. I'll just put it that way. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here. It was a real pleasure to talk to you and see all the places where we are aligned in our understanding about nutrition and the importance of nutrition, particularly for prenatal health and infant health. So thank
Yeah.
you.
Likewise. It was great. Thank
Yep.
you.
Thanks. Bye. Dianne Kaler here again. If you found this conversation interesting and haven't already become a student at NTI, check us out at ntischool.com. We hope to see you soon.